Well, thank you for to the organizers for inviting me to come and talk about some of the work I've been doing in active learning, or as I sort of retitled the talk, interactive machine learning strategies for cost-effective NLP annotation. So just to motivate things a little bit to get started, although I doubt for this audience it needs too much motivation. So this is the cover of this year's Nucleic Acids Research Databases issue. And so we're now, as of this January, up to more than 1,300 molecular biology databases. 92 of them were new last year. And the way these work is they employ PhD-level biologists whose job it is basically to keep up with the literature. So as new journal articles come out, update that this protein interacts with this protein, and here's a reference to the source article that showed this. And the problem is that, so this is a chart showing all of the articles that were made available through the NIH public access portal every year up until about last summer. So these curators are dealing with 5,000 to 6,000 new articles per month. So the bandwidth is too high. So how can we use machine learning and natural language processing technology to assist them in doing this task? So one area that I worked in as a graduate student was information extraction. So if you're given a large collection of texts, in this case biomedical journal abstracts or articles, the task is to automatically build a network of the important entities, so proteins, cell lines, drugs, model organisms, et cetera, and extract those from the text and build the network. And one such system that I built was called Abner. Maybe you're familiar with it. So the input is just this unstructured text. So this is an abstract from a particular article, and the system can automatically scan through and detect mentions of DNA locations, cell lines, cell types, gene products, etc. And then use this to populate a knowledge base of interactions and things. So lots of systems have been built on top of Abner. It's not just a slick GUI, it's got an API, so people can build on top of it too. So this is all well and good. Other applications of information extraction, if you go to this zoom.info website, it's kind of creepy how much they know about you just by scanning publicly available web pages. Google also uses this kind of technology in building the citation graph that powers Google Scholar. And the way these systems usually work is through supervised machine learning. So we've got a human expert, we've got some machine learning algorithm, and we've got a lot of unannotated data. And the typical supervised learning approach is to sample some examples out of the unannotated data. So in this case of the citations, these are actual references from papers. And then a human manually annotates mentions of like the author field and the title and the book title, page numbers, publisher, so on and so forth. And then feeds that to some machine learning mechanism to induce an information extraction system. So the problems with this are that, as most everybody in this room probably knows, supervised learning often needs thousands or hundreds of thousands of instances to train a good classifier. So for example, Abner was trained on more than 18,000 labeled sentences. So just raise your hand out of curiosity if you've been involved in annotating data for machine learning systems. That's what I was expecting. So you know how much of a pain it can be. So how do we reduce this load? I think this particular pipeline can be a vast underutilization of both human and machine resources. So one reason is that communication is only one way, from the human into the machine learning system. Another reason is that it's indirect communication. It's rather than telling the machine something that we already know about the problem to help bootstrap its learning, we communicate indirectly by labeling these instances. All right, and the other problem is there's a ton of unlabeled data that we're not even taking advantage of because we haven't had the human resources to annotate it all. If we did, we wouldn't be trying to train machine learning systems to do it for us. So if I were the teacher for this machine learning student, probably the supervised learning paradigm gets a C+. Or since I'm a computer scientist, maybe a C++. All right. So here's a quote attributed to Pablo Picasso that's motivated a lot of my research. Computers are useless. They can only give you answers. I would add, oftentimes they give you the wrong answer. So what happens if we imbue computers with the ability to ask questions as part of their learning process? So this is the field of active learning. And the goal is to reduce overall labeling costs. So the main change here is that the machine learning algorithm already has some hypothesis. It's allowed to inspect tons of unlabeled data and select the most informative instances to be annotated, pass those off to the human annotator, who then annotates them, and this becomes now kind of a closed loop cycle. All right, so this was really exciting, had some promising early results. This was a simulation study on doing extraction for the biomedical named entity recognition task that I showed you earlier. The x-axis is the number of sentences that were annotated, and the y-axis is the overall F1 measure over all the different categories. And as you can see in this simulation study, the active learning approach yields more accurate classifiers in less time. Really excited about this. So I decided to take it to the next level and do some actual user studies rather than just using pre-annotated data and simulating it, and was a bit disappointed. So one thing that we discovered is that the size of the annotated corpus does not necessarily correlate with real annotation costs, at least if you're measuring that cost in terms of time, if you're paying people by the hour, for example. So over here on the left, this is a similar curve to the previous one, where the x-axis is the number of instances, and we get a slight gain using active learning. But over on the right side, this is the same learning curve, the same data, but now plotted where cost is the actual annotation time, and there's virtually no difference. And one reason for this is perhaps the most informative instances for the machine learner are difficult for the machine for similar reasons that they're difficult for people, so it takes people longer, so on and so forth. And this phenomenon has also been observed in other domains, other NLP domains like part-of-speech tagging, computer vision domains, information retrieval, and so on and so forth. As a caveat, I'm not going to talk, or as a side note, I'm not going to talk much about this, but I also tried simultaneously trying to train regression models to predict how long it will take someone to annotate this sentence and then fold that into the active learning system. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So I decided at one point to just forego that route and change my thinking about the whole interactive annotation process. So this is a slightly different paradigm called interactive learning, and the idea is to treat the machine learning loop more like a conversation. So let the human show some initiative in the task by offering or volunteering some knowledge or advice that we already have about the problem. And then also let the machine show some initiative by asking questions, so this is active learning, but also trying to teach itself by combining what we've told it with the vast amounts of unlabeled data, so this is semi-supervised learning. And so this interactive learning paradigm that I'm proposing is sort of a combination of all three of these in one system. So what this might look like, going back to our citation extraction example, a human might just know that the word proceedings, for example, is a good indicator of the label book title for this particular domain. So we can dream up some rule that says when you see the word proceedings, that's book title. If you see some regular expression of 4 digits in a row, then that indicates the date. Some repeating sequence of initials is probably the author field, so on and so forth. And then pass this domain knowledge over to the machine learning system, who can combine those rules with the vast amounts of unlabeled data to induce a hypothesis that kind of explains the data that it sees constrained by these rules. And then ask questions about the parts that it doesn't understand. So one type of question it might ask is, I see this word conference and I think it's pretty salient. What is the label that corresponds to the word conference? Or perhaps, I think the word conference indicates book title. Am I right or am I wrong? Another type of question might be, here's an example. Here's a citation. Please annotate it for me. So far, you've only given me examples of computer science conferences. I don't know how to parse a biology journal article citation. So, and then the human can respond in kind to answer those questions, and then the process repeats. So I think this interactive learning paradigm plays to our complementary strengths. So machines are relatively inexpensive compared to people. They don't have much of anything better to do but crunch the data we give them. We do have better things to do. So active learning can help minimize the costs of human annotation in this loop. Machines are also high bandwidth. They're happy to crunch numbers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and process millions of examples. We're not happy with that. So semi-supervised learning allows the machine to take what little, hopefully reduced annotation effort we put in and still make use of all of the unannotated data. And then finally, the machines don't really have much knowledge or intuition about the problems, but we do. And so by offering mechanisms for us to inject our domain knowledge or offer advice about the problem, helps us to play to everyone's strengths. So if we can achieve this, I think that's probably an A+ machine learning system. Excuse me. So for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about 3 research projects that I've done kind of on my way of coming to this view of interactive machine learning. And one caveat is, from this point on, I'm not going to be talking about biomedical NLP motivated applications. But I think the ideas are still generalizable to the specific kinds of annotations that are done in biomedical and clinical NLP. So the first is active feature labeling. Then I'll talk about an interactive text classification system called DUALIST. And then finally, if there's time, talk about pushing DUALIST into the crowd and taking advantage of crowdsourcing. So the first 2 parts of the talk are mainly focused on machine learning algorithms and enabling new kinds of communication. And then the third part is more how can we take advantage of human resources. And the active feature labeling, this is joint work with Gregory Druck and Andrew McCollum at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So the particular model that we'll be using for this information extraction task is a conditional random field. You're probably mostly familiar with it, but if you're not, it's a discriminatively trained hidden Markov model, or a probabilistic finite state machine is a good way to think about it, where each of the labels correspond to a state, and we have transitions between them. So given some new instance, like here's a citation, the machine just tries to find the most probable path through the model, and that path corresponds to the labels for the information extraction. So we first of all would like to imbue this learning algorithm with some kind of human advice, and the particular advice that we're going to focus on is feature labeling. So features are the input variables used by the machine learning system. And feature labels are simple probabilistic rules that can express human knowledge or advice. So for example, like the instances I gave earlier, the word proceedings implies the book title label, or a regular expression of 4 digits implies the date label, and maybe a repeating sequence of initials implies either the author or the editor field for BibTeX extraction. And more generally, we've got some feature, and that maps to some probability distribution over the labels for tokens where that feature exists. And so the way we can encode this as a probability distribution, one simple approach is just to say, if proceedings implies book title, then it's a 100% chance that it has the book title label and 0% chance for everything else. Or we'll split the difference if there are 2 labels. There are other ways of estimating these probability distributions, but this turns out to be a fairly good one in practice. So why do we even want to label features? Well, one reason is that in practice and user studies, it's a lot easier for people to do. If presented with a feature and saying, give me a label for this feature, it often takes them just 2 to 4 seconds, whereas annotating a full instance can take anywhere from 10 seconds to a minute or more, depending on the domain. And also, labeling one feature can describe thousands of instances. Every time you see that feature and you're projecting some kind of information onto that word. So you get a lot more bang for your buck. Whereas if you label an instance, you only get information for that one instance. So the particular learning algorithm that we're going to use here is called generalized expectation criteria. The idea is to minimize this loss function, which is the KL divergence between two probability distributions. And these distributions are the feature label reference distributions. So for example, what these pies mean. And the expected model distribution for all of the feature labels that have been provided, subject to a parameter regularization term that prevents overfitting, so that it basically doesn't just memorize the rules that we gave it, but it tries to generalize to other unseen instances as well. And we run this optimization over all of the unlabeled data using limited memory BFGS, or your favorite quasi-Newton optimizer. And just to make things more concrete, so this is the user interface that we built to do this interactive feature labeling. Over here on the left are a bunch of features presented to the user, clustered by distributional similarity. And here we'll zoom in. If the user clicks on the word Kaufman, so this is a particular feature, on the right-hand side, they're given a random sample of the sentences or the citations where that feature is used in context so that they can get a quick overview idea of the label distributions. And also, up at the top, we provide the machine's current expected label distribution for that feature. So what this means is 95.2% of the time, when I see the word Kaufman, I think it belongs to the publisher field. 1.2% of the time, I think it belongs to author, and so on and so forth for the different labels. So if the user were then to decide that the word Kaufman should be labeled with publisher, that provides a reference distribution that says 100% publisher. And this is the upper in the upper right-hand corner is the model's expected label distribution. And what the training procedure is trying to do is for each such labeling, we want to get those pies to look as similar as possible. So that's what the training procedure is doing. Excuse me. So an important question is, how do we choose which features now to present in this user interface? There are hundreds of thousands or millions of these features. We can only fit like 20 of them or something here. Or 100, I guess. So this is a new form of active learning that's not asking questions about instances, but about features. And ideally, we'd use some fancy decision theoretic approach that's well motivated to select the features that explicitly maximize some utility measure. It turns out to be very difficult and intractable, so instead we use a more efficient approach. We tried a bunch of different heuristics, and there's a paper on this if you're interested in looking into it. This is one that worked very well. It's just the average model uncertainty for words that have this feature times some scaling, an appropriate scaling factor. So it's basically how uncertain we are about this particular feature times the log of how frequently that particular feature occurs. We might be uncertain about a feature because it only occurs once in the corpus, and we don't want to ask questions about those. So we'll ask questions about things that do occur frequently, but we're also uncertain about. So, this is a simulation study that we did using two benchmark data sets. One was these research citations, another was a Craigslist classifieds data set trying to extract rent and location, neighborhood, utility information, for example, out of Craigslist apartment classifieds. We compared different combinations of active learning versus passive learning and feature labeling versus actual full-on instance labeling. And we evaluated learner after 10 minutes of simulated annotation using a simulated annotator, the details of which are in Manham and Column 2008. So here are the results for the research citations data set. This is the accuracy after 10 minutes of simulated annotation. And as we can see, both of the feature labeling approaches are more accurate than either of the full instance labeling approaches. And furthermore, actively choosing the features as opposed to using a topic modeling approach like LDA to choose the features also makes better use out of the time. And the results are even more stark for the Craigslist classifieds data set. So this was kind of promising preliminary results, but as I said, this was a simulated study, and as I learned by trying to take active learning and using it in actual human studies, we got different results. So we decided to actually do real human user studies as well. using the interface that I showed you before. And so here are the learning curves for one user annotating the research citations corpus. We only used the two active learning variants, but one was labeling features and one was fully labeling instances. And here after 10 minutes, you can see, actually after about 3 or 4 minutes, active learning by labeling features is significantly better than active learning by fully labeling the instances. We got the same results for a different user on the same data set, and also on the Craigslist classifieds data set. Here for the entire learning curve, active learning by labeling features is superior. So this interactive feature labeling approach, it's kind of a new framework for machine learning with feature labels instead of instance labels. And demonstrably, both in simulated and user studies, the passive learning, it outperforms both passive learning by labeling features and active and passive learning by fully labeling instances. All right, so this is exciting, but I kind of misled you a little bit. I've got a dirty little secret to confess. These experiments, the user studies, weren't exactly interactive in the way we would like it to be. And the reason is users worked for 2 minutes, labeling as many features as they could. And then they went away and did something else for half hour to 45 minutes while the conditional random field retrained. They got pinged when it converged and it was ready for some new annotations. And then they worked for 2 minutes, and this process repeated up to 10 minutes. So ideally, what we want is a much more real-time interactive closed-loop system. And there are some other limitations, too, vis-a-vis the vision of interactive learning that I presented earlier. Humans can't just inject feature knowledge. They can only label features that are presented to them in this particular interface. And it would also be nice to allow the human to choose between volunteering feature labels and domain knowledge, labeling feature queries, and labeling instance queries, too, because there's value in both of these directions. So while this active feature labeling work is kind of an advance over typical active learning, I'd still probably only give it a B+. So where do we go from here? So now I'll talk about shift tasks a little bit to interactive text classification, but a truly closed-loop interactive system that tries to address these issues. And the name of the system is called DUALIST, and if things go according to plan, I've got a demo for you. So what I'm loading up here is the famous Pang and Lee sentiment classification corpus. This is a set of movie reviews, I think, taken from the IMDb website. And over here on the left-hand side, this is an actual movie review. And at the bottom of each review, we can say this is a negative or positive review. This is saying that the movie is a good movie or a bad movie. Or abstain if we don't actually know. And over on the right-hand side, we've got columns that correspond to the different classes in this particular task, so negative and positive. And we can just kind of jumpstart this process by saying the word bad indicates a negative review, and the word good indicates a positive review. And then click the submit label and retrain, and it's immediately ask us a new set of questions. Over here on the left, we've got documents that it's selected via active learning. And on the right-hand side are features that it's soliciting labels for. It's like atrocity, I think, indicates a negative review. Stupid. Jean-Claude Van Damme apparently is associated with negative movie reviews. Wasting. Over on the right-hand side, things like finest, excellent. And we can retrain and get a new set of. Does anybody have any words they'd like to volunteer? At the very beginning, they were just frequency ranked. Now they're being selected actively.
And none of them are not in the corpus.
Right, that's true. However, we can type in arbitrary words that may or may not be in the corpus. But
do you deal with a variation of any kind, like singular, plural kind of thing?
In this work, no, but you can imagine some more sophisticated pipelines that do that. But this is kind of a first stab at building this kind of interactive interface. So switching gears back to the talk. Yeah. So the underlying learning model in this case is multinomial naive Bayes. It's known to work well for text problems. It's fast. You can train it in linear time. And you just simply estimate a label prior probability as well as some conditional feature probabilities. And so this is kind of a walkthrough of the modified naive Bayes learning algorithm. Here's our vocabulary of words. We have two sets of parameters. One is the probability of seeing that word if it's a positive document versus a negative document. And we'll start out in the typical naive Bayes fashion of just adding a pseudo count of 1 for each of these. Words. And so this is like a flat or uninformative prior, which is good for avoiding 0 probabilities and inference and so on. But if we have labeled features, we can actually do something more sophisticated by adding an informative prior. So in this case, this is a non-symmetric Dirichlet prior. We're basically saying we're boosting the probability of having seen the word bad in a negative document if the word bad is labeled with negative, and correspondingly for fantastic and positive documents, just by artificially boosting these pseudo counts. And then we can run normal maximum likelihood estimation for all of the negative documents and the positive documents that we have labeled in the corpus. And at this point, we actually have a classifier that we could use. But we're also not taking advantage at this point of all of the unlabeled data that's available. So we can take one step of the EM algorithm by probabilistically labeling all of the unlabeled data and incrementing our counts accordingly. And so this is another fast update to naive Bayes that we can do to combine feature labels, active learning, and semi-supervised learning all into one system. So the active learning algorithms are, again, we'd like to use some ideal decision theoretic approach, but we approximate that using uncertainty sampling for documents, which is just rank ordering the documents by how uncertain we are, or the highest entropy in the posterior label distribution, according to the model. And to select features, we use expected information gain, which is the average uncertainty of all of the documents in the corpus minus the average uncertainty of all the documents that contain this particular feature. And so now I have some actual human-in-the-loop experiments to show. This is a slightly more exhaustive study than the one that I just showed before, where we have 3 benchmark data sets, 5 different annotators who each annotated these data sets under 3 different conditions. One was the full DUALIST interface that we just walked through in a demo. One is active learning, but only presented with documents, so they only get the left-hand panel and not the feature labeling features, software features. And then the third condition was passive learning, or just randomly choosing instances to present, but still only labeling documents. So these experiments consisted of 6-minute trials with a fixed 90% train, 10% test split of the corpus that was held constant for all users under all conditions. So what we see here, each of these curves corresponds to a different user for the WebKB task. And each of the 3 colored lines correspond to the different user conditions for that particular user. So up in the left-hand corner, there we have. We see that the DUALIST condition for this user is training a much more accurate classifier in much less time than in the other 2 cases. Active learning is doing slightly better. I don't know where my mouse keeps going, but is this a pointer? Yeah, there we go. And this pattern holds for all 4 of the different users on this particular task. The dark dashed line at the very top is fully supervised learning. So if we had labels for all of the documents in the training set, that's kind of an upper bound that we might expect. So at the end of 6 minutes, all of these users are getting within about 90% of the upper bound. Here are some results for the science data set. So this is a subset of the 20 news groups corpus. Similar results. And here are results for the movie review data set. So this is a more difficult data set, so the results aren't quite as stark, but we still see this general consistent pattern of the DUALIST interface where they can label both instances and features interactively is doing better than the other two conditions. So an interesting failure case, this is from the movie reviews corpus. This particular user didn't label any features until right there. And so you can see just right before time ran out, a spike in accuracy. So the lesson here is like actually label features. Another interesting failure case was, this is on the WebKB corpus. This particular user found the words that were asked about for the course label. So this is, the task here is to classify university web pages into being about faculty web pages, student web pages, research projects, and courses. They found the course words to be much more understandable and interpretable than the others. So 71% of all their feature labels were just for that particular class. Sometimes noisily so, like the word instructor also indicates a faculty web page, but this particular user didn't provide that information. So lesson 2 is to maintain a class balance among the different features that you label. And in some follow-up work that I'm not going to go into detail, we actually did further user studies, and it turns out that these two features in the DUALIST interface, labeling features and maintaining a class balance among the features that you label, were the two strongest predictors of the ultimate accuracy of the classifier. So going back to the beginning of the talk a little bit, so I presented this naive Bayes approach. What about training logistic regression models using the generalized expectation, the discriminative model that was, so logistic regression is a special case of a conditional random field. So how do these two compare? I mean, this interface is modular enough that we could actually train a logistic regression using GE instead of the naive Bayes approach. So how do they compare in terms of accuracy? In supervised learning, the theory predicts that naive Bayes would be superior when you've got few labeled examples, but asymptotically, as you get more and more labeled examples, a discriminative approach like logistic regression would be better. But that's for supervised learning. Here we've got active semi-supervised learning with labeled features too, so we don't really know the differences to expect. Another question is in terms of speed. So both are linear, but there's an additional term in the analysis of logistic regression because it has to do multiple passes over the data before it converges. So what's the difference in practice? Do we really need to use naive Bayes because of its speed and accuracy? So the way to parse this figure, this is a study I did with using different amounts of labeled features and labeled instances. So in this 0, 0 spot right here, that's with absolutely no training data at all, so there's no difference between logistic regression and naive Bayes. This is as we add more and more labeled instances but no labeled features. This is if we add more labeled features but no labeled instances, and this corner is if we've got 100 labeled instances and 80 labeled features. Okay, the red cells are where naive Bayes is superior, and the blue cells are where logistic regression is superior. This is for the science corpus. Here's the pattern for the other corpora. So in general, it appears to be that, yes, logistic regression is yields more accurate classifiers in most cases. I don't really have a good explanation for what's going on here for Science and Reuters, other than the fact that it's kind of known that these two data sets are more clustery, and it could be that the EM approach of naive Bayes is just doing a better job at capturing the clusteriness of those data sets. This is a comparison in terms of speed. So routinely, all of these data sets have tens of thousands of instances. The naive Bayes is routinely finishing in like less than 1/10 of a second for all of these. So it would scale much better to millions or tens of millions of documents. So DUALIST is a new interactive learning framework that can combine multiple different learning strategies under one roof. It's intuitive for people to use, and we can train fast, low cost, and under the right conditions, accurate classifiers. But sometimes people behave suboptimally by not labeling features or not maintaining a class balance among the features that they label. And there's also this trade-off of speed versus accuracy of the actual classifier that we use in the loop. And how much time do I have left?
Half an hour.
Really?
I think so.
All right, well, there's plenty of time to go in the next section then. So given these caveats, I'd say DUALIST gets us to about an A-, but it's still not an A+ interactive machine learning system. So now I'll talk about some kind of recent and preliminary work in trying to push this interactive machine learning paradigm into the cloud. So far we've only talked about interactive machine learning where there's one annotator and one machine learning system that are talking to each other back and forth. So I'd like to propose a different model of crowdsourcing, interactive crowdsourcing, where we've got multiple annotators that are interacting with multiple different fast, lightweight user interfaces like DUALIST. And then we can combine all of the annotations that they provide to train a post hoc classifier using logistic regression, because we don't necessarily in this last step need the speed and interactivity of the fast naive Bayes approach. And we could even build on this even further and having like the posterior predictions of this more accurate classifier at the end of the pipeline be used as priors, for example, at the beginning of the pipeline. But for right now, we'll just talk about this feed-forward kind of approach. So the hope is to combine the best of both worlds. We want the speed and interactivity of naive Bayes. At the end of the day, the accuracy of a logistic regression classifier, and the collective wisdom of the crowd in case we get a few duds that don't annotate things the way that is most optimal. So the first question here is, can we effectively take these interactively attained labels through DUALIST, through the naive Bayes, the queries that are generated by the naive Bayes approach, and then reuse those to train a logistic regression classifier post hoc? So there's been some previous work in active learning to use one particular model to generate queries and gather data, but then reusing that data with a different type of classifier. And the results have been very mixed. In general, it seems to actually hurt things. I think because of the inductive bias of the classifier that's being used to ask the questions doesn't necessarily line up with the inductive bias of the classifier that you want to use at the end of the day. However, we're also obtaining feature labels here, and there are some other differences in this interactive paradigm. So we don't necessarily know what would happen. Is it possible that these additional feature labels actually can yield better classifiers at the end of the day? And the other question is, if we have multiple users that are interactively annotating text and features and exploring different parts of the instance space, when we combine all those together at the end of the day, do we have a more accurate classifier? So in response to the first question, this is a plot showing the results from the previous experiments, where the horizontal axis is the accuracy of the naive Bayes classifier embedded in DUALIST as the annotator was using it. And the vertical axis is if we take all of those annotations and just plug them into a logistic regression training mechanism using generalized expectation. And the dotted line along the diagonal is where those accuracies are the same. So in the active and passive document-only conditions, so again, this is only annotating documents and not annotating any features, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference in this particular data set. However, under DUALIST, where we're actually getting feature labels as well, the logistic regression classifier is much more accurate. And we see this pattern on the other two data sets as well. There's only one user for whom this post hoc retraining of logistic regression seemed to hurt things. Now, in terms of question 2, combining these different users together, here are results on the movie reviews data set. This column shows the average of the accuracy of the 5 individual annotators using naive Bayes. This is the average accuracy of the 5 annotators independently. if we use those annotations to train a logistic regression post hoc, these are the corresponding columns where if we pool all of their annotations together and then train one final classifier for use in production. And then at the end here, this is kind of an upper bound of a fully supervised classifier. So if the 90% training set had labels on all of the documents and we trained logistic regression or naive Bayes, this is what we would expect. And we have similar results for the other two data sets. And in particular, on movie reviews and WebKB, this pooling post hoc training approach yields almost state-of-the-art. And to put this into perspective, these experiments used a combined 30 minutes of annotation time and 6 minutes of wall clock time, because we had 5 different annotators working for 6 minutes. So one caveat here is, though, that these were computer science researchers. So they kind of know something about machine learning, NLP. Maybe the way that they use the system is different than if we actually truly wanted to deploy this in a more typical crowdsourcing setting. So we also ran these experiments on Amazon Mechanical Turk. I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with Mechanical Turk? At least 2 people? Okay, cool. So these are non-experts, right? Most of them probably don't know much about machine learning. There was a brief tutorial on how to use the DUALIST interface, but and they represent a different demographic than computer science researchers. So we had these Turkers replicate these previous experiments on the movie reviews and the science corpora under the same 3 interface conditions, working for 10 minutes instead of 6 minutes each. And we had more than 25 subjects. We initially had 30 subjects each, but some of them had computer issues, and we had to throw them away. So we deployed DUALIST on the internet and had these Turkers do the work. And so here's some results with respect to question 1. So this is reusing their annotations for logistic regression training. This is under the DUALIST condition. This shows the distribution of the accuracies on the movie reviews corpus of the Turkers interactively training a classifier for the movie reviews corpus. It's a very difficult task. On average, about 50% accuracy, and there's 2 labels. However, if we then use these annotations to train a logistic regression post hoc, the accuracy goes way up. 5 minutes, okay, good. However, there's not a significant difference between the accuracies of the naive Bayes or logistic regression in either the passive or active document-only conditions. There's an interesting difference on the science corpus. Logistic regression seems to consistently hurt things. But again, this might be due to what I said earlier, that this is a more clustery data set, and maybe the EM procedure being used with naive Bayes helps to make it more accurate. But we do see that under the DUALIST condition, these non-expert Mechanical Turkers are still training more accurate classifiers than either the active or the passive document cases. Now, in terms of combining these annotations together to train one final logistic regression classifier, we again see this pattern where pooling their annotations together yields a more accurate classifier. And here we're talking about 4 hours of total human effort across all the different annotators and about 10 minutes of wall clock time. So even though these are very kind of preliminary and somewhat inconclusive results, I think it holds promise in using this paradigm of interactive machine learning, and the crowd holds promise in obtaining lots of different labels, both on instances and features, quickly and cost effectively, and then being able to reuse those annotations in a post hoc, more accurate training procedure that doesn't necessarily have to be as quick and interactive. There's a lot of interesting research opportunities that are still open, like what human behaviors are important in these interactive training scenarios, and how do we encourage these behaviors, and how can we extend this architecture even further. So there's still a lot to learn, a lot of open research directions, But I think if we can understand those better, maybe we'll be at an A+ machine learning system. And just as a quick wrap up, I'm kind of excited to be at this workshop to hear different takes that people have on annotation and interactive annotation, because I think this is interdisciplinary work. On the one hand, there are machine learning issues such as how do we develop algorithms that do active learning and semi-supervised learning and incorporate domain knowledge in effective ways. But there's also human-computer interaction issues, like how do we design interfaces that facilitate and open up communication between the two parties? You know, how do we get the machine to understand the human input as well as the machine to the human to understand what the machine has learned and or wants to learn. And then also issues of human behavior. Once we, active learning for so long had done experiments kind of in a vacuum using pre-annotated UCI corpora and things like that. But then once we started to do true interactive user studies, people didn't behave the way that we expected them to. So understanding how humans intuitively try to teach machines can also really help in this area. And with that, I'll wrap up. The DUALIST system is open source, and you can download and play with it and extend it, and I hope you do. And I've also written a book that just came out a couple of months ago on active learning, so if you're interested in that and want to get a more fundamental understanding of the breadth of the field, that's available from Morgan and Claypool Publishers. So thanks.
Yeah, so I wonder a little bit about the expense that you didn't talk about, which is the expense of setting up interactive machine learning model versus just using a straightforward supervised learning. The time that your annotators are spending is quite small, right? I mean, what's 4 hours these days for annotation? How many days did it take to set up the interactive, active learning system, as opposed to what you could have done if you just annotated for those days instead?
Right. Well, the hope is in building these systems that they're more general. The experiments I've run here are starting tabula rasa. Like there's some new task with no annotations, but you have corpora and you have some particular vocabulary of labels or something that you're interested in. If you're not starting from ground zero, I don't really know.
Even if you are starting from ground zero, right? I mean, the amount of time it takes to set up an interactive active learning system is certainly more than, let's say 50 hours of annotation, right? So you should be comparing 50 hours of annotation versus however many hours it takes you to set the system up.
That's true. But the hope is that these approaches are generalizable enough that once we've actually kind of figured out the general mechanisms of how to do interactive annotation, once you do have a new problem, you can actually throw existing infrastructure that's been built at it, and maybe with some customization. But I mean, that's the hope. But you're right. There was a non-trivial cost in me developing these systems and deploying them, right?
Just to follow up on that, I think it's reasonable to talk about a kind of steady state cost. But I'm curious, you concluded that 4 hours of annotation would still make this cost effective, and I'm interested in how you concluded that, because 4 hours of annotation that's pretty noisy, has a cost associated with it in terms of what you're paying, for example, the Turkers.
Well, they're pretty much free.
Well, they're not free. I mean, bottom line. And so have you looked at that cost?
Not yet. So sort of in this diagram, I've spent most of my time kind of on the machine learning end, and less time on the other two ends. And I think, let's see, I guess, yeah, cost is more on that end of the spectrum. And there's different kinds of costs. I mean, another cost that I think I'm totally ignoring here, and most of us in this room probably ignore, is that the specs change, for example. I mean, once maybe you've built a really accurate classifier for one particular spec, but as soon as you add a new label or something like that, how do you bootstrap off of that? And how do you get the machine to recognize and propose, oh, there's this other class that you're not talking about but should exist? that's another way of opening up the communication, and there are costs associated with that too.
Have you looked at have you looked at calibrating the logistic regression? Like, do you have any idea how good the probability predictions are? Because it looked like the evaluations were 0, 1.
The evaluations are 0, 1, but no. We haven't done anything more sophisticated for calibrating the probabilities.
Just a brief question. You talked about the movie language, or one of the databases being a bit more complicated, and therefore changing your data set. I guess, how would you classify the nature of that complication, and how does that apply again back to what we're seeing here in medicine and biotech? I guess, how would you extrapolate what you saw in terms of different data sets you're starting to work with?
So I don't remember saying that one data set was more complicated, but the movie reviews data set is a more difficult classification task. Like the supervised.
Yeah, that's it. Sorry, that's what I meant.
Okay, right. So I think the reason is there's a lot of subtlety in the movie reviews data set because it's sentiment analysis, and a good movie review is going to talk about both the positive and the negative aspects of the movie, even if the overall conclusion is negative. I think that does happen in biology where you've got a lot of speculative discussion. In biomedical journal abstracts, they don't make a hard conclusion, but they might say, this result suggests that, A and B interact or something like that. I guess as far as how that impacts the extraction or classification mechanisms, I don't know if it makes a significant difference, but if we actually want to build systems that do data mining like on top of what's extracted, you want to take that speculation into account. Or maybe you want to actually interactively train a system that can estimate what the confidence is. Like if we speculate this to be the case. I don't know if that addresses your question sufficiently, but okay.
Have you looked at problems where the most predictive features aren't just simple words? So if you're trying to do things with times and stuff like that, hence maybe the most predictive
Right.
feature, but there's not an obvious way for a human to look at that.
Right. So
Parsing this.
right. So the general idea here is if the features that you're using have some kind of semantic meaning. So if you're doing text classification or information extraction or something, we're not just using words in the information extraction case. We also have regular expressions that one could notice this regularity and type in regular expressions that capture something. If you have metadata, for example, like the date of publication for this particular article or this particular clinical report or something like that, and that has some signal that's intuitive to you, I see no reason why you couldn't also, you have to engineer the interface to facilitate that kind of conversation, but I think you could also use that kind of information as priors on the predictions that you're trying to do. But the key is as long as the feature is interpretable.
If you don't mind waiting for the
Yep.
microphone, because it's getting recorded, and your question will be recorded without a microphone.
Sorry about that.
So one of the advantages of using features instead of labeling features instead of labeling instances is that you get a lot of coverage, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you said at the very beginning. But what happens if you label a feature and you're wrong, and the person annotator is wrong with their intuition? Now, instead of messing up a single instance, they've messed up
Right.
a lot of data.
Right, and we observe that happening here somewhere, right there. Like they just found one particular category of features to be much more interpretable. It can also happen that somebody's completely wrong. Actually, in doing the movie reviews experiments on Mechanical Turk, a lot of people just labeled words like not and don't as negative because they're negations. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative movie review, right? So it can happen, and perhaps either through better training or through this kind of crowdsourcing, on average, you can take care of that signal. Now, one nice thing about the generalized expectation model is if some of your feature labels just in aggregate disagree with the other labels that you've provided, you don't have to match those constraints exactly. It just tries to do as well as it can, and if it can't get this particular bad feature label to agree, then it will just, the model will not agree with that particular piece of advice. And actually, in some error analysis that we've done in generalized expectation, the constraints that don't get matched very well, you can go back and review those, and they turn out to be erroneous feature labels. So that's another aspect that we haven't even looked into in user studies and the actual interactive setting, is the model saying, hey, you told me this piece of advice, I think it's bad advice, and here's why. So that's another extension of this kind of paradigm, I think.
I have a similar question. The example you gave about the label for Kaufman and the user saying, okay, this is a publisher label, it looked like the model actually had a better set of probabilities where it considered that Kaufman really could be the name of an author or the name of an editor. So again, what happens when the user even subtly sort of makes an overgeneralization and makes a poorer example than the model already had?
So there have been also experiments. Those were really hard constraints, just saying if you label it with Kaufman, it's 100% Kaufman. We've also tried things like making it 90% Kaufman and then uniformly distributed among all of the other labels. We've also done experiments trying to estimate those probabilities by cheating, looking at real data and getting like the real probabilities. And empirically, it doesn't make much difference. Having more constraints that are bad estimates is better than having a few really good estimated constraints, if that makes sense.
Hi. So this idea of labeling features is such a different paradigm that it takes a little bit of time for me to sort of get my head around the way it works. But it seems like once you have that paradigm, you can totally change the way that you even think about how are you going to annotate. So you, maybe modeling this data, have the best idea of the top 20 features and what they're, just do those yourself, and you can knock that out in 30 seconds and then give that to the annotators, and they can start looking at
right. There are some classification problems where, like the Reuters corpus, basically, you only need 2 or 3 words per category, and you throw it at either of these learning mechanisms, and it's a state-of-the-art classifier. For a lot of more interesting NLP tests, that's not necessarily the case, but perhaps there are. So, for example, when we were walking through this example, wonderful. I wouldn't necessarily, off the top of my head, have thought of a lot of these positive words. And if we retrain, like it'll keep asking us, well, okay, things timed out, and at least that didn't happen during the main demo. But like it may come up with things like Oscar, right? And that didn't initially occur to me. But this kind of paradigm, like combining the best of both worlds, you have some domain knowledge, but you may not necessarily have an entire model of the data distribution in your head. But by injecting the sliver of prior knowledge that you do have allows the model to then start asking you questions and dig into the long tail that maybe you didn't think about but are really discriminative training signals.
Oh, do you have a question?
Yes, one last question. So in a way, what you're doing is human-guided feature selection. Right.
It's not just feature selection, because we're not throwing away the other features. And as a matter of fact, these models, because of the way they work, they implicitly try to propagate a label signal from the features that you label onto features that you haven't necessarily labeled. So like for the Morgan Kaufman example, let's say, if we label the word Kaufman, another feature that is correlated with the word Kaufman is that the previous word was Morgan, So even though we didn't label the previous word Morgan as a feature that predicts publisher, the model will actually try to push that parameter mass over to that feature, and it learns to generalize a bit better. But it's human-guided. It's human-guided kind of logical reasoning, statistical logical reasoning. I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but
Thanks so much.
thank you very much.